Good morning, everybody. Let's get started. People will be wandering in, I'm sure. This is Julia Gable, who's with the Diocesan Commission on Stewardship, who's come to start a conversation about stewardship, which I think you'll find very interesting. I know I will. We have some challenging passages in the Bible to look at and argue over, but she's going to be very gentle with us, right? You promised. And she's going to start with her own story, which I'm looking forward to. Julie is a member of Holy Trinity.
Great. Thank you, Robin. And thank you all for being here. It's great to be here at St. Bartholomew's. I come here often for things like convocation meetings and why can't I think of any other? Verger assemblies and choir functions. So it feels like another home. So like Robin said, I'm with the Commission on Stewardship, which means that sometimes I get invited to other churches in the diocese to talk about stewardship, and I love doing it, although it's not my natural mode. I'm not a public speaker. I just have a passion for stewardship, and I feel like if I share my story with people, that it might resonate with some folks. And so my story is basically I was been an Episcopalian all my life. My father is an Episcopal priest. He was the rector at St. Martin in the Fields for 24 years. And so I was raised in the church and loved beyond my imagining, which I believe is how God loves us all. And that's my upbringing. And I also, since I am a priest kid, we would sit around the dinner table sometimes and actually talk about stewardship and tithing. And so I can remember a time when my father on Sunday lunch said, of course we tithe. We hadn't really been asking him about it, but it did come up in the course of a Sunday afternoon lunch. And so I had that idea in my head that this is what we do as Gables. And then I became an adult, and I sort of fell out, didn't go to church for several years. And then I did, just in a nutshell, my niece was singing in the children's choir at Holy Trinity as a 5-year-old. And I felt that I needed to be there. And so I did start gently going back to church and sneaking out before, not staying for coffee, and just kind of keeping my head down. I love church, I love the music, I love the prayers. I feel good here, but I don't want to talk to anybody. And it worked. I was able to sneak out for probably a year or 2 years, and eventually, gradually, got invited to participate in a ministry, which was totally okay with me. I'm a baseball fan, and the parish life person asked me to help sell tickets to a Braves game that the parish was going to attend. And that way I got to talk about baseball with people, and I met some people who were friendly and nice, and gradually got more and more involved at church at Holy Trinity. And as that happened, I sort of thought about my giving. Of course, every year we get asked to think about our giving, and I was giving a little bit every Sunday that I was there, and that felt okay, because I didn't really have that sense of, I was about to say I didn't have that sense of belonging, but truly I did have that sense of belonging, because like I said, I just felt like this is in my DNA, which it is. So I realized I needed to make a pledge. And I did do that. That wasn't such a big step for me. I pledged basically the amount that I had been giving every Sunday that I was there. I pledged to do that every week. And that felt good, and sort of really the upshot of this is the more I got involved and got invited to be on the vestry, and met more and more people, heard more and more of the music, the sermons, felt more and more like I'd found a home, watched my niece grow up. I knew that I needed to work towards tithing because, as I said, this was a family set value that I knew about because my parents talked about it. And so I increased my pledge a little bit, and finally worked my way up to the tithe. So my story is not, I've been tithing all my life, it's the best thing in the world. My story is I kind of got a sense of being led to it from an example of my generous parents. So I know other people on the Commission on Stewardship, their story is, I got invited to be the stewardship chair, and all of a sudden I realized that we were going to be asking people to pledge, and not just to pledge, but to give, to work towards giving 1/10 of their income to the church. And it freaked them out. These are my colleagues. And they prayed about it, and they got a message that they were supposed to tithe right then and there. And they did. And I did not get that message. I got the message to work my way up to it, which I think is, everybody gets a different message. So that's a little bit about my story. I think there's probably more to it, but I thought maybe we could start with a few kind of icebreaker questions about giving. Nobody needs to share unless they feel like they'd like to. Oh, that's my story. I will say this about stewardship stories. When I went to the Diocesan Commission on Stewardship workshop, and I was still new to the ministry, Mal Underwood, who was the chair at the time, I was kind of walking out the door. It was the end of the day. We'd been there all day long and just kind of, drinking from a fire hose of information about stewardship and how to conduct the annual campaign and all kinds of things. And Mal said, be sure that you can tell somebody your stewardship story in the narthex, or just have it ready to talk about your journey and where you are. It doesn't mean you're the perfect steward. It just means share with somebody what you've been through and where you're at. And so as he said that, I was like, okay, got it, one more thing, and then I left. And then a week or two later, somebody at Holy Trinity said, would you please write a newsletter article about stewardship, your stewardship story for the newsletter? And I said, okay, sure. So I tried to write the story, and I typed it out, and it was terrible, and I, figuratively crumpled up the paper and threw it in the trash several times. And then I finally wrote down the actual story and how I felt about giving, and the part about not being very generous at the beginning, and realizing that that's really not who I feel like I am. And so it was a good message. And so I have a slide that just says stewardship stories, just to say, many of you have already been invited to write or talk about your stewardship story, or be on a video. I recommend it. So just a few questions to get us started. If anybody would like to to consider, what gift have you most recently received, and who gave it to you, and what did it mean? You could answer any of these questions. A gift that you've given away recently, and what was the meaning there? And another good question is, who do you consider to be a role model of a generous, giving person? And any question that speaks to you that you feel like sharing.
My mother was certainly a role model. Oh, I bet they can hear me.
Can you all hear Julie?
Can you hear me? Yeah. My mother was a good role model, and absolutely regular churchgoers, there wasn't a lot of discussion of religion at home. It was like you got it in church. But I know for my parents, it came across not as a command or anything other than, yes, this is who we are. That, oh yeah, a tip of their really modest, I only realized as an adult, income went to their church, period, end of story. And it wasn't considered, wasn't conveyed as a strain or overly righteous or anything. It just was a fact, and it was what they chose to do in the most willing fashion. And as my mother once said, my sister was asking her about something completely extraneous. This was decades later. Mother, do you really want to do that? I mean, it sounds like they're just, manipulating you into doing this service work. And do you really want to? And she said, well, yeah, it's my duty, and I like to do my duty. and she was. So, yeah, I have that message of, it's not an issue.
No.
Or a sacrifice, even when it absolutely had to have been a sacrifice. It was not considered to be so.
Right. Honest, a cheerful giver.
Oh, very cheerful givers, yes. A very slim means.
Thank you. Yes.
I can't think of anything that I gift or that I received, because all that stuff isn't important the most. And I can think of lots of people who have been generous giving people. But I have this strong conviction that you give away what you have. And I get really annoyed when the news, if we gave enough money that was channeled in a good way, the world would be so much better. And so I do a lot of volunteer work and no gift or it's not a gift for me, it's just how you do it.
The helping out is a way to make the world a better place, and I know that you can see how it works in the community, the community work. Thank you. Yeah, I definitely can see that money's not always the answer. It's more what's coming from your heart. Beverly?
Well, I'm thinking of the first time I went back to church as an adult, I was 26, and it was on there, in fact, this is in Australia, this is the beginning of, it must have been the day of the intaking of the commitments and so on. Anyway, there's this guy who somehow he talked in such a way that there were dollar notes around. I grew up going to church and you put in your leftovers, you put in your change. People would rattle in their pockets and put change in. And so I was 26 before I saw people putting, that was the biggest thing. And we went straight to 10% with both students. We went straight to the 10%. Then there's, but anyway. Stewardship speakers can have a profound effect. That's what I'm telling you, Jewel.
Well, we've got several people. I saw you.
Sure. I was thinking about what gift have you most recently given away, and this is maybe not as much my gift, this is a little bit my boyfriend's gift too, but I was thinking about our relationship to material things and that responsibility we have to care for things. And one of the, I was out of town and he texted me and he said our neighbor who was moving out, he was retiring, and he just left all this stuff on her, like books, beautiful books, and just all of these things that in theory neighbors would go through and take, but they might take a few, but the rest would just kind of go to the landfill. And he texted me and he's like, do you want me to get these? And so I answered yes, and so he ended up just like getting all these books and all these things, and then when I got back, I sort of went through it and said, oh look, there's this Christmas stuff he's getting rid of, like packaged, unused, and just thinking about kind of our relationship to material things and how they're a responsibility. And sometimes I really want to throw things out, like it's a struggle and it's easy, right? But there's this responsibility that sometimes is not always fun to say, okay, but is it a landfill or is it still usable? If so, like, what's the effort that's required to keep going back and using that? So I think that's what's on my mind now as I think about like lessening what I have in life is also this responsibility to not just dump it, right? It's like, and when we buy new things or think about what we invest in, like, what's our long-term investment in keeping these things alive and useful and meaningful?
Right, and being good stewards of things that maybe other people can use. And I know some people don't bring in, like, say, another sweater into their closet unless they agree to themselves to pass a sweater back to the thrift store. Thank you. Yeah, and then
Yeah, so a role model for me in terms of generous giving are my in-laws. So my husband's parents, who don't have a ton of money at all, but they're very committed, like Beverly's talking about leftovers, like they're very committed to like we give our first fruits to God, and so they give 10% of their small income before taxes to the church, and then they give a bunch more on top of that to like organizations and individuals, and then they also are super generous with their time. So they both work full time still, and my mother-in-law is always like writing really thoughtful notes to people and making homemade cards for them and going to visit elderly people from their church, and just in so many ways, like in their family, but also in their larger community, like giving of their time and their talent along with their money. So they're inspiring.
Awesome. I love the first fruits, the concept of it, but also the commitment to it, to really give first Sunday of the month, write that check, and not wait till the end. Ken, sorry, it took me a while to get to you.
This is not specifically church focused, but I was going to say but it's the absolute icon and saint in my life, who is in a high place in heaven now, is my dad, who was born in 1922, so he was a kid in the Great Depression. To have had his father abandon the family before that, grows up, enlists in the army, goes off and fights in 3 wars, and saw God knows what in life. Lived through a lot of hardship. And I can kind of encapsulate it into little vignettes, but his whole life to me was about generous self-giving. You hear about these people who have, these horrendous lives, and they turn in a very dark way. But my dad was the kind of guy who was always able to see his cup as overflowing. It is physically impossible for me to pass a Salvation Army kettle, because I remember as a kid, my dad said, we always give to the Salvation Army. They're a pretty good outfit, as he put his money in the kettle. When a guy's lying next to you with his guts blown out, you don't ask questions, you give blood. When the 20-year-old scruffy-something kid was on the roadside with a broken-down car, we pulled over, Dad helped him with the car, took him to the gas station, because that's what we do. And I mean, it took me that till adulthood to realize that he probably saw an image of maybe one of his kids in that or whatever. I'm always affected by it. We do things, we give things.
Thank you, that's awesome. Completely generous spirit. That's what we're talking about. Just who stands out as the generous people, the generous person in your life, the generous people in your family, and how it seems what I'm getting from a lot of our stories is that that's just who these people are. That's how it comes naturally to be generous. It's not a burden. I want to say it's a privilege, but it's deeper than that. It's who people are in their hearts. So thank you for sharing those stories. They're very powerful. And like Robin said, we have a couple of Bible passages to look at, to reflect on, and they are a little challenging, and believe me, I'm not trying to put any of us on the spot. They're really just for food for thought, and so we'll look. So the idea here is we're going to read this passage, and we'll be looking for, first of all, we'll look for challenges or demands from God, and then we'll list those out, and then after that we'll look for promises from God in the same passage. So could I ask somebody to volunteer to read this from Malachi? And I'll give you the microphone, just to make sure.
Ever since the days of your ancestors, you have turned aside from my statutes and have not kept them. Return to me, and I will return to you, says the Lord of hosts. But you say, how shall we return? Will anyone rob God? Yet you are robbing me. But you say, how are we robbing you? In your tithes and offerings. You are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation of you. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, so that there may be food in my house, and thus put you to the test, says the Lord of hosts. See if I will not open the windows of heaven for you, and pour down for you an overflowing blessing. I will rebuke the locust for you, so that it will not destroy the produce of your soil, and your vine in the field shall not be barren, says the Lord of hosts. Then all nations will count you happy, for you will be a land of delight, says the Lord of hosts.
This is just for open answers, and I'll try, I don't know if I'll be very good at this, but I'll try to type up our list of challenges or demands from God as we call them out. And then also, like I said, after that we'll go through and call out where we see promises. What is God promising to me? Oh, I think if I take that down, then you won't be able to see it. So let's just keep them in our minds. Oh, well, we could write them up on the newsprint. Robin, do you feel like being a scribe?
I can do that.
looks like the first one is return to me.
Yes, good. Return to me is a challenge or a demand from God. Do you see the others?
Bring the full tithe.
Okay, bring the full tithe. That's one of my stewardship friends says that it's like God saying, "I dare you." It's pretty challenging.
Ensure there's food in your house.
Yes, yeah. Ensure there's food in my house. Thank you, Robin. I thought I was going to be able to multitask, but no.
Ensure. That's what I thought. Thank you. I want to embarrass myself too much.
Put me to the test.
Put me to the test. That's, yeah. Any others?
Well, at the beginning, keep my statutes, so that's probably more than one thing. More than just tithing,
Let's, for sure, keep my statutes. That's pretty, that's like an umbrella clause.
but yes,
That's a big one,
including tithing.
including. So, good list. Return to me, bring the full tithe, ensure there's food in my house, put me to the test, keep my statutes. And we'll have a separate list for what is God promising us in this passage.
Well, I have to start out saying, we've just done a book called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies Unknown. And she just highlighted so much the prosperity gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you give and you do all these faithful things, then you will be overflowed with blessings. You'll have plenty of. So just when you start talking about promises, then I think I need to note that for myself.
Appreciate
That
that.
it's not simplistic.
Thank you, Beverly. I totally agree. I should have prefaced this by saying this is not prosperity gospel message, that at least it's not where I'm coming from. It's not, if I do this, then God will do this. Gosh, Beverly, if you can think of a way to kind of pull us out of that, but definitely, if anybody's thinking that, that's really not what I was saying. I don't think that that my giving is going to mean that I get showered with riches or that nothing bad will happen. But I do think that my giving will be freeing for me, that it helps me to be who God is calling me to be. That's what I believe. but not that I will become rich by doing. Ken?
It's the distinction between being transactional, which God is not, and being relational, which we believe God is.
That's perfect. So Ken said it's the distinction between being transactional, which we are not, and God is not, is what he said, and being relational, which God is.
It says it in the second sentence, return to me, and I will return to you. And I saw that as very, actually I love that phrase, and very much relational.
The father of the prodigal son who goes running
Right.
and sees the son coming back.
And
That's
here's,
right.
here's a way to return, by giving of your first fruits.
Right, it's built in. The relational part is throughout. And certainly, the prodigal son is a great example. The father is overjoyed to see his son. That's all. That's it. It's the relation. It's not the. Certainly not the wealth of the son. It's the wealth of the relationship. If that makes sense.
Can I put restored relationship as the first?
Thank you. Robin is going to put restored relationship as a promise.
Referring back to God's covenant with his people.
Yeah, it's built in. God will never let us go. We can walk away, but God is not going to let us go. Any other promises we want to write down? I think we pretty much said the whole thing in one promise, but would anybody like to add?
I also like the overflowing blessing, not in material things, but as a result of that restored relationship.
Yeah, thank you. The overflowing blessing. And Mel Underwood is my stewardship mentor, and this is his favorite stewardship passage, and he says, what does it mean for God to open the windows of heaven for you and pour down upon you an overflowing blessing? And of course it's a rhetorical question. Everybody thinks about it, like we are all thinking about it. It doesn't mean you're going to win the lottery. I'm not sure what it means, but this is Mal speaking, I'm quoting him. Do I want for God to open the windows of heaven for me and pour down upon me an overflowing blessing? Yeah, whatever that is, it's God's gift, and it's mystical, it's a mystery, but we want it. Yes?
There are, not to be the naysayer, but there are some pretty transactional sounding promises in the end, right? I'm going to rebuke the locust, so you're going to have good crops. I'm going to not make your fields barren, right? Those are like material things. And so I feel like to not read the prosperity gospel in this is like, take some reading against the grain. I certainly appreciate that reading against the grain as a possible returning to me and restored relationships reading, but just thought it's important to point out that it's there.
It is so there. And again, I think it's, I don't know. I'm glad we're talking about it. It's definitely a hard one to sort of avoid, because you're right.
It's also a principle of the Hebrew Scriptures, is the lex talionis, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You do this, I'll do that. It's very transactional, very retributive. That's why we have the Gospels.
Well, perhaps for me, referring back to God's voice to the ancestors, the story is that everything was made by God as a gift. I mean, and I think that's the writing of the relationship, part of the writing of the relationship with God within, that we are recipients of a gift, and that's what sets up. It's not ours. We have a sense of entitlement. I think that's a spiritual struggle, the sense of entitlement, and maybe they did, people around Malachi too. It's when we can really get it that it's a gift. Now that isn't talking about that really.
Right. But that too is part of the creation story and the whole Bible. Thank you. So, I guess I should check the time.
Another 10 minutes max.
Yep. All right, we can do another passage. Well, these are more questions that I don't think we'll get into, but I'm just going to throw them out. What is preventing me from responding? And if I overcome these barriers that prevent me from responding to God's demand and living God's promise, how might my life be different? And I mean, feel free to comment, but I think we've already got the relationship part of how might my life be different. And also, those questions almost sound like they're a little bit, gotcha kind of questions, and that's not what we're trying to do. So I don't want that to happen. I think let's do read this one. Would somebody like to read 2 Corinthians?
Okay, the point is this: the one who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the one who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each of you must give as you have made up your mind, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver, and God is able to provide you with every blessing in abundance, so that by always having enough of everything, you may share abundantly in every good work. As it is written, He scatters abroad, He gives to the poor, His righteousness endures forever. He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way for your great generosity, which will produce thanksgiving to God through us. For the rendering of this ministry not only supplies the needs of the saints, but also overflows with many thanksgivings to God.
So again, this one is a passage where we can look for God's promises and God's demands and God's promises. But we may have a few minutes if anybody would like to share what they see as a promise in this passage.
Okay. So I have a comment that it seems that this passage is more directly about community and the relationship of everybody in a community, as well as in a relationship with God. So that, the idea, I think metaphorically in the previous passage, was also about community, and that the blessings come maybe because you're doing something with the community, so nobody is going without, that kind of idea.
Did everybody hear Amanda? That's another heart of the matter comment, where metaphorically this passage is more about giving and being part of a community, and that's where the blessing comes from. Thank you. Did I get that more or less right? That's exactly what this is about. And many of you have heard the origin of the word stewardship is from warden of the pigsty, and so it comes from manor life, where the lord of the manor would entrust the sty ward with the most important resource on the manor, which was the food source. And the sty ward it's charged with taking care of the food source, not for their own benefit, but for the benefit of the whole community. And that is what we get from this passage, I think. Rather than demands, I think going back to our stories about gifts and generosity, it was more about the community living and being a joyful giver and the relationships than anything else. That's the theme that I think we got.
And I noticed with this one, again, we can slip into the transactional. It could be read that way.
Agreed.
But I appreciate very much that it says, God is able to provide you with blessings and enough of everything. Not too much,
Yes.
but enough. And that's certainly been my experience.
Thanks. Mary?
As we're talking about this one thing, I like this one a bit better, but it's because of some language that we've been using through this conversation around demands, which I'm struggling. Like I don't like that. It does not set up an image of God for me that is care. And I think one thing that jumps out at me with the Corinthians that it kind of, and I think it may be expectations, hopes for us. But I like this one because there are a few spots in it where like it's as a clear concept. God loves the cheerful giver. God, this idea of and God is able to provide. So it's just for me a helpful contrast to that idea of demanding, sort of like the demanding parent group that can have for me a negative connotation that I don't think I want. It can have good connotations too, but I like this because it resists that.
Because it what?
It resists that kind of negative
The dynamic. Thank you so much for that. I feel like I'm gonna, if I ever do this exercise again, I'm gonna change the language to expectations and hopes because that's so much more inviting.
We need to wrap up.
Thanks, Robin. Thank you guys so much for being here. Learned a lot from you. I mean, this is not something I do every day, and I really appreciate your stories and your guidance and help and bringing out